She had never seen a man like this before. Dust kicked up from the boots of an American soldier as he strolled past the barracks, not with a rifle or barked orders, but with something even more disarming, a confident grin, a cowboy hat, and a tin of peaches. Her fingers clutched the edge of her uniform, stiff with discipline, but her eyes betrayed her. The man tilted his hat, offered the can with a casual, "You hungry, miss?" And that's when it happened. The woman who had survived hunger, shame, indoctrination, who had obeyed every protocol of her imperial upbringing, nodded. A single, almost imperceptible nod, one that would set off a cascade of emotions, consequences, and quiet defiance. She was a POW. He was her captor. But in that moment, under the searing Texas sun, something cracked. Not because of force, but because of kindness. And the war she was trained for was nothing like the one she was living now. She hadn't even meant to nod. It had slipped through her, unguarded, involuntary, a flicker of hunger that moved faster than shame. The cowboy didn't linger on her hesitation. He just smiled wider, handed her the can with a rusted spoon taped to the side, and said, "Ain't much, but it's cold." Then he tipped his hat and walked off toward the guard station, boots crunching against the dry dust of the yard. She stared at the tin in her hands. The label was peeling, the metal cool. The syrup inside shifted with a gentle slosh. She had not tasted peaches in years, maybe never. And now, standing barefoot in a foreign prison camp, surrounded by strangers and fences, she held a can of fruit, offered not with cruelty, but with kindness. It was too strange to understand, too gentle to trust. The camp itself was quiet in a way that made her uneasy. Back home, silence meant danger. The pause before discipline, before the scream of orders or the sharp crack of a commanding officer's hand. But here, silence was routine. The American guards didn't bark. They didn't march. They moved with a relaxed rhythm, their rifles held like accessories rather than weapons. The women shuffled from their barracks to the mess hall and back again, half expecting the illusion to break at any moment. She had been warned that capture was worse than death, that Americans were brutes, savages, that they would defile and degrade. But all she'd seen were clean kitchens, orderly beds, and guards who called her ma'am and offered cigarettes, as if they were greeters in some absurd hotel rather than victors in a world war. And then there was him, the cowboy. He had arrived 3 days ago, younger than the others, with a slow drawl and a battered hat that didn't seem to belong in a war zone. He leaned against fences like he'd grown up alongside them, chewed sunflower seeds like a man with all the time in the world, and whistled songs no one in the camp recognized. Some of the women called him the Ghost of Texas. Others called him nothing at all, afraid to name something so far outside the world they understood. But she watched him, not because he was kind, but because he was familiar in a strange way. He didn't treat her like a prisoner. He treated her like a neighbor, like a human. And that was more frightening than cruelty would have been. The other women noticed, too. One whispered that he must be trying to trick her. Another scoffed that it was dishonor to accept gifts from the enemy. But none of them had said no when their turn came to be handed soup, clean towels, or blankets. Still, the peach was different. The peach was personal. It wasn't rationed or assigned. It was given. That made it dangerous. She sat on the edge of her cot that night, the can untouched in her lap. She ran her fingers along the curve of the metal, remembering how her commanding officer back in Japan once told her that to surrender was to vanish, to become invisible in the eyes of your ancestors. But this fruit in her hands said otherwise. It said she existed. It said someone had seen her, remembered her, chosen her. The moon rose behind the barbed wire, and the desert wind slipped through the cracks in the wood slats of the barracks. Someone was playing a harmonica, faint, clumsy notes drifting through the air like questions. She opened the can. The metal gave with a soft hiss. The syrup shimmered like gold in the dim light. She dipped the spoon, brought it to her lips. The sweetness hit her like a slap. Her mouth flooded with it, sugar, fruit, memory. She swallowed, then trembled. One of the other women turned in her bed, eyes catching hers. "Did you eat it?" the woman asked, voice low. She didn't answer. She couldn't. She just held the empty spoon to her lips, as if trying to make the moment last. Because she knew, in the pit of her stomach and the hollow of her chest, that nothing was the same anymore. It wasn't about peaches. It was about choosing to taste something outside the boundaries of loyalty, of stepping, just barely, beyond the line drawn for her by men in medals and mothers in grief. A small act, a spoonful, but it echoed louder than any oath. And the strangest part was, she wanted more. She remembered the oath clearly, not because she believed it, but because it had been burned into her like smoke into cloth. She had stood in the cold hallway of a concrete barracks, her fists clenched at her sides, a line of other girls beside her, all in identical uniforms that smelled of mildew and fear. The instructor's voice had been sharp, masculine, unyielding. "Better to die with honor than live in shame." The words had not been a suggestion, they were scripture. It wasn't just the soldiers who carried the Bushido code into battle. It was the nurses, the radio operators, the clerks, the girls with steady hands and hollow stomachs. It was expected of all of them. She had only been 19 when she first entered the Auxiliary Training Center in Sasebo. Her father, already lost to the sea somewhere near Midway, was held up as a martyr. Her mother said little, but packed her daughter's bag with pressed linen and dried rice. "Make us proud," was all she said at the station. That was the weight she carried in. Pride as burden, pride as armor, pride as leash. The days were spent running drills in worn-out shoes, folding medical gauze with military precision, reciting creeds until their throats were hoarse. There were no questions, only commands, no warmth, only duty. When one girl collapsed from exhaustion, she was dragged out of line and beaten where they all could see. Not for weakness, but for daring to show it. The instructors warned them constantly. Capture is humiliation. If the enemy touches you, you become a ghost. If they feed you, you must refuse. If they show mercy, it is a trick. "Kill yourself before they take you," one officer said plainly, as if advising how to treat a sprained ankle. "And if you cannot, then hope they kill you quickly." She had believed it. All of it. Until she saw the look in her commander's eyes as the Americans breached the shoreline. He hadn't raised his weapon. He had run. That was the moment everything splintered. It happened on a beach in Luzon. The sky was black with smoke, the sound of artillery distant but steady. She had been tending to a wounded gunner with a shattered leg when the order came down. Withdraw. Every man for himself. She had no weapon, no orders, just blood on her hands and the smell of fire in her lungs. She tried to run with the others, but her feet froze when she saw the American soldiers cresting the ridge. They didn't shout. They didn't fire. One of them waved a white cloth. She stood still, heart pounding, body trembling like a sapling in the wind. The wounded soldier beside her muttered, "Don't let them take me." But she could not move, could not lift him, could not even look away. The Americans found her there, on her knees in the dirt. She waited for the blow, the rifle butt, the laughter. Instead, a medic knelt beside her, checked her hands for injuries, and asked her if she was all right. She didn't answer, couldn't. She was too busy trying to reconcile what was happening with what she had always known. It only deepened when she arrived at the camp. She had braced for cages, hunger, punishment. Instead, she was given a cot, a blanket, and a tin bowl of soup that smelled like onions and broth. No one shouted, no one spit. The guards didn't leer or mock. They took her name gently, though they pronounced it poorly, and handed her clean clothes. That night she lay awake under a roof that didn't leak, on a mattress that didn't ache, and in the quiet hum of distant conversation she felt something colder than fear slip into her chest. Confusion. If surrender was death, why was she still breathing? If shame was the only outcome, why did she feel, even for a moment, safe? The world she had been trained for had vanished, and something new, something impossible, had taken its place. She hadn't known what dignity smelled like until it arrived in the form of hot steam and lavender soap. The showers hissed behind the concrete wall, and the women stepped out wrapped in thick towels that smelled of starch instead of mildew. The sensation of being clean, of water that ran warm instead of cold, of scrubbing away weeks of dried blood and dirt, was more jarring than any punishment could have been. She looked down at her arms, the skin pale and pink from the heat, and felt something she couldn't name. It wasn't relief. Not yet. It was suspicion twisted with awe. They were given proper meals, eggs in the morning, soft bread with butter, even sweet tea on certain days. The bunks had real blankets. The latrines had running water. Every small comfort felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been taught. She had expected starvation, humiliation, maybe even assault, but instead she found soup ladled gently into her bowl by a cook who nodded without scorn. Each spoonful warmed her stomach and confused her soul. Around her, the other women struggled with the same contradiction. One refused to eat anything at all, convinced the food was drugged. Another wept silently through every meal, unable to reconcile the taste of meat with the image of her starving siblings in Nagasaki. Even the act of lying on a soft mattress became a point of tension. Some sat stiffly on the edge, too ashamed to lie back. Others clutched the blankets like they were temporary miracles destined to be stolen. There was a wall between them, not one built of wire, but of silence. No one spoke about the cowboy, though all of them watched him. He was a curiosity at first, but quickly became something stranger, a symbol none of them wanted to name. His easy manner, his slouched posture, his refusal to carry his rifle like a threat. Every time he whistled a tune or tipped his hat at one of the women, the air inside the camp shifted as if he were a gust of wind trying to blow down a house built of brittle pride. She caught herself watching him from the garden one afternoon. He was leaning against a post near the guard gate, chewing on a piece of straw and humming to himself. He looked like a character from one of those cheap American posters she had seen years ago. The cowboy, the drifter, the outlaw, with kind eyes. She didn't want to smile, but her face betrayed her. He noticed. Of course he did. He nodded, slow and deliberate, and said, "Ain't bad out today, huh?" She didn't answer. She looked away. But the words stuck, not because they meant anything, but because they didn't. No orders, no judgment, just talk, as if they were two neighbors standing by a fence. Later that evening, another woman whispered, "He looks at you." "I don't care," she replied too quickly. But she did. Not because she liked him or trusted him, but because he was dangerous in a way she hadn't prepared for. His casualness chipped away at the edges of her certainty. He didn't demand anything, and that made her drop her guard. He spoke to the women sometimes, small things, Observations about the weather, stories about his horse back home, jokes no one fully understood, but everyone listened to anyway. When he passed, they didn't flinch, they froze, because his kindness was not performative, it was ordinary, and that was terrifying. Every gesture from him felt like a question. What if everything you were told was a lie? She hated that the question lingered. She hated that it made her feel. But most of all, she hated that she began to look forward to the sound of his boots on the dirt, because behind the barbed wire something more unsettling than captivity had taken root. The possibility that she was still a person, and someone else, someone she was told to hate, saw it too. It began with a clipboard and a stack of thin-lined paper. The guard handed it to her with the same ease he might have offered a tray of food. "Write your folks," he said. "Tell 'em you're okay." The pencil that accompanied it was short, dull at the tip, worn down like a relic passed through too many hands. It didn't look like much, but when she wrapped her fingers around it, it felt heavier than any weapon she'd ever held. She sat on the bunk, staring at the blank sheet. Around her the room was hushed. A few other women had received the same materials, but no one spoke. There was a strange reverence in the air, like a church before confession. Some women took the paper, folded it without writing, and slid it into their pockets. Others left it untouched, as if the act of writing might expose them to something they couldn't take back. She hesitated, then pressed the pencil to the page. The first word she wrote was not her name. It was Mother. What followed wasn't a letter, not really. It was a fracture, a crack in the wall she had spent years building. "They feed us. The food is warm. I sleep indoors. The guards, they are not cruel." The words felt wrong as they left her mind and traveled down the page, not because they were lies, but because they were true. She kept waiting for her hand to stop, for some internal voice to scream that this was betrayal. But it didn't. There was only the soft sound of pencil scratching paper and the sudden realization that she no longer knew who she was writing as. Across the room, another prisoner sat holding her pencil like it was a blade. She didn't write, just stared at the paper with wide, unreadable eyes. That woman, once a fierce defender of the Emperor's ideals, now shook as if the paper might scream. For some, silence was the only answer. They had grown up in homes where emotion was kept behind locked doors. They had memorized the names of emperors and battles and victory slogans, but never learned how to say, "I am afraid," or "I am still alive." The letters they were told to write became mirrors, and many of them couldn't bear to look. The cowboy found her sitting outside the barracks later that day, her half-finished letter in her lap. He leaned against the post, squinting into the sun, and said, "You can tell your mama we ain't monsters. Least, I hope you will." She didn't reply, but the words curled around something inside her. We ain't monsters. It was the simplest thing, said with no drama, no ceremony, but it left a mark deeper than command or correction ever had. He walked away before she could form a response. That night she read her own letter back to herself. The sentences were clumsy, her grammar flawed. But in every line, something undeniable pulsed. She had seen kindness, unasked for, undeserved, but real. She didn't send the letter. Not yet. She folded it instead and placed it inside her pillowcase. A secret, a crack. Not because she was afraid of what her mother might read, but because she was afraid of what it meant that she had written it at all. It meant she was beginning to believe her own eyes, and that was more dangerous than any bullet. It began as a hum, distant, uneven, drifting through the cracked wood panels of the barracks like smoke. At first it was almost imperceptible, a murmur beneath the usual sounds of boots on gravel and tin cups clinking against trays. Then, on one unusually still evening, it came clearer. A slow, aching drawl, a man's voice pressing words into melody like fingerprints into soft wax. "I'm so lonesome I could cry." She froze, mid-step, unsure whether to recoil or lean closer. It was music, but not the martial rhythms of Japan, not the piercing flutes or the rigid drums that accompanied drills and ceremonies. This was softer, almost broken, a kind of sorrow without shame. The other women heard it too. Some turned away, feigning indifference. Others stared into the floor, unmoving. No one spoke. The guards had set up a record player by the rec hall, a small metal box with a wide speaker horn. Most of them ignored the prisoners when it played. They smoked and laughed, tapping their boots to rhythms foreign to the captives' ears. The music wafted across the compound in waves. Hank Williams, Gene Autry, Western swing with its fiddles and slide guitars. For her, it was maddening at first. The melodies didn't follow the scales she knew. The language, though occasionally recognizable, slipped through her comprehension like rain through cupped hands. And yet, there was something in it, a note held just long enough to ache, a twang that sounded like longing. The enemy was not supposed to long. The enemy was not supposed to mourn. But these songs carried both. They pierced her where lectures had failed. They bypassed the armor of ideology and went straight to the bones. Not because she understood them, but because she felt them. One night, she found herself sitting just outside the barracks as the music played. The sky was deep with stars, the kind that only appeared in the absence of city lights or gunfire. The tune playing was slower than usual. A ballad, she guessed. One guard chuckled and said, "That one's for when you miss someone you'll never see again?" She didn't know what missing someone sounded like, but she recognized the hollow in her chest, and then came the harmonica. It was the cowboy, of course, sitting by the fence post again, legs stretched out, hat pulled low over his brow. The harmonica looked small in his hands, but the sound it produced was anything but. Wavering, human, filled with a kind of searching that made her throat tighten. He didn't look at her, didn't try to speak. He just played, soft and steady, the way someone might talk to themselves on a long walk home. She hadn't planned to hum. It just happened. A low note, almost silent. She stopped as soon as she realized, looked around. No one noticed, but she had. She had let something in. Later, back in her bunk, one of the women hissed, "You were humming." "I wasn't," she lied, heart pounding. But she was, because the song had taken root. And in her mind, it played again and again, the sorrow of it twining with her own in ways she didn't understand. She didn't know the words, but she knew the feeling. The cowboy didn't say anything the next day, but when she passed him on the way to the laundry shed, he tapped his harmonica twice against his knee, like a nod, like he knew. And that was the most disarming thing of all, because even in war, no one tells you that the softest sound can change you. Not orders, not bullets, not even a peach, but a song. A song you can't unhear. He didn't bring the harmonica the next day. He brought a peach. It was the same brand as before, dull tin, the label wrinkled from heat and handling. He didn't say anything at first, just held it out to her, arm extended through the open gap in the wire gate where supplies were passed. She hesitated, hands at her sides, but she didn't step back. That was enough for him. He placed the can gently on the wooden ledge and tipped his hat as usual. Then he walked away. That was how it began. No rule was broken, no line crossed. Just the small act of giving followed by the equally small act of receiving. He never forced words. For days it was the same. He'd show up with something small, Sometimes a fruit, once a book of matches with a cartoon horse drawn on the inside flap, another time a slice of cornbread wrapped in a napkin. She never said anything, but she stopped pretending not to notice. And that was where the ritual began. In the late afternoon, when the sun fell sideways and turned the fences to gold, he would lean against his post and talk to the air. Not to her, not exactly, but loud enough for her to hear. Stories about Oklahoma, about cows that refused to be herded, about his little sister who used to braid wildflowers into her hair and claimed she was a witch. Naoko sat within earshot, sometimes knitting, sometimes peeling potatoes, always pretending she wasn't listening. But the corner of her mouth began to soften. Her shoulders lost their stiffness. And once, when he joked that he was the worst cowboy in Texas because he still couldn't ride bareback, her breath betrayed her, the hint of a chuckle buried in her throat. He noticed, but he didn't gloat. Then, one day, after weeks of silence and peaches and music in the background, he did something reckless. He asked her name. It wasn't the first time she'd heard her name since capture. It was the first time someone wanted to know it, truly know it. Not for a roster, not for a record, but because they wanted to speak it. She froze. A guard behind him raised an eyebrow. The women around her stilled like rabbits in tall grass. Naoko didn't answer, but she didn't walk away. The next day the peach came with a napkin, a name scrawled in crooked katakana, Naoko. She stared at it for a long time. She didn't laugh. She didn't correct him. She just let her fingers brush the paper before tucking it into her sleeve. The day after that, when he greeted her with a casual, "Mornin'," she finally replied. Just one word. Naoko. It fell from her lips like something both foreign and familiar, like unlocking a door that had rusted shut. He smiled, soft and unbothered, like he'd known all along. "Naoko," he repeated, slower this time, careful, as if handling something breakable. The others didn't mention it, but they saw, and she knew they did. Saying her name aloud felt like crossing a threshold, like standing too close to a fire, because now she had been seen, not just noticed, seen. And seeing came with risk, because if someone saw you, they might start caring, and if you cared, you might start hoping. And in a war built on obedience and loss, hope was the most dangerous thing of all. The assignment came without ceremony. A clipboard, a nod toward the far edge of the compound, and a gesture toward a patch of earth bordered by scrap wood and wire. "Garden detail," the guard said. "Weeds, mostly." Naoko bowed instinctively, though the motion felt strange now, half-remembered, like a language she no longer spoke fluently. She walked toward the plot with a bucket in one hand and a trowel in the other, her boots sinking slightly into soil darker than anything she remembered from home. The garden had started as a practical thing, a way to supplement rations, a way to keep prisoners occupied. But to Naoko it felt like something else entirely. The earth was soft, forgiving. It did not shout. It did not judge. When she knelt, the smell of soil rose around her, rich and alive, nothing like the dust and ash she associated with war. She pressed her fingers into it, and for the first time in months her hands were not tending wounds or folding cloth or gripping fear. They were simply touching the ground. The cowboy appeared near the fence some time later, quiet as ever. He watched her work for a moment, hat shading his eyes. Then he reached into his pocket and slid something through the wire. A small paper packet, creased at the edges. She picked it up cautiously. Inside were seeds, tiny, dark, unremarkable. Tucked inside the fold was a scrap of paper with uneven handwriting. "Try these. They like the sun." Her throat tightened. It was not the words themselves, but the assumption behind them, that there would be a tomorrow, that the sun mattered, that she might care whether something grew. She didn't look at him when she nodded, but she nodded. Planting the seeds felt like an act of quiet rebellion. In her training, growth had always been framed as sacrifice. The nation grew stronger because individuals were consumed. But here, growth was individual, gentle, unobserved. She pressed the seeds into the soil one by one, covering them carefully, as if tucking in children she would never have. The cowboy didn't hover. He never did. He leaned against the fence, said something about the weather, then wandered off. But his presence lingered in the way encouragement does, not loud, not demanding, but steady. Days passed, then weeks. The garden became her refuge. She learned the rhythm of watering, the patience of waiting. Some seeds did not sprout. Others pushed stubbornly through the surface, pale green against dark earth. Each morning she checked them with a mixture of anticipation and fear, half expecting them to disappear overnight. But they didn't. They grew, slowly, insistently. Other women noticed. One crouched beside her one afternoon and touched a leaf with trembling fingers. "It's alive," she whispered, as if afraid the plant might hear her and retreat. Another brought a cup of water unasked. They did not speak much, but they shared the silence in a way that felt different now, less guarded. The flowers were not impressive. Small blooms, modest colors, but they stood there, defiant in their fragility, proof that something could take root even behind barbed wire. For Naoko, they became a measure of time, a way to mark survival not by days endured, but by life coaxed forward. One evening the cowboy stopped and nodded toward the blossoms. "Told ya," he said simply. "They like the sun." She almost smiled. That night she dreamed not of gunfire or orders, but of fields, wide open fields where nothing chased her and nothing demanded proof of loyalty. She woke with the image still vivid, and for a moment guilt surged, sharp and familiar. But it didn't stay. It softened, like soil after rain. The flowers did not change her circumstances. She was still a prisoner. The fences still stood. The guards still counted heads at dusk. But inside her something had shifted. The flowers whispered a truth she had never been taught. Survival was not shameful. Growth was not betrayal. She began to understand that hope did not erase loss. It existed alongside it, and as the flowers bloomed, quietly and without permission, Naoko realized she was doing the same. But understanding did not mean peace, and hope did not silence the war inside her. Naoko stood in the garden, the flowers now reaching up past her knees, their small faces turning instinctively toward the sun. She knelt to pull a weed and suddenly remembered another garden, one she had only glimpsed once, outside the training barracks back in Fukuoka. It had been wild and untended, an afterthought behind the hospital dormitory. Her commander had caught her looking at it once and barked, "Beauty is for those who forget duty." She had looked away, just as she had been taught. But the memory returned now with startling force. Not just the words, but the slap. A single strike across the cheek, not out of rage, but discipline. She'd asked whether the wounded should be treated if they had surrendered. He didn't yell. He simply struck her and said, "You are not here to think. You are here to serve." Now, she thought constantly. Questioned everything. She had seen the enemy laugh. She had eaten food prepared by their hands. She had received kindness from a man whose country had flattened her city. And worse still, she had started to believe he meant it. Was she betraying her people, her training, the fallen? Or had she been betrayed first by those who taught her to feel nothing, to obey blindly, to die without question, in the quiet moments, before roll call, after sunset, while watching her flowers bend in the wind? Naoko wrestled with the contradiction. She remembered the shrill whistles, the drills in the rain, the shrieking propaganda broadcasts that insisted death was nobler than defeat. But here, defeat had brought her life. A strange, dignified, complicated life. She laughed now. Not often, but enough to feel the change. Sometimes the cowboy would make a joke so dumb she couldn't help herself. Other times, a fellow prisoner would mimic one of the guards, and they'd stifle giggles like children beneath blankets. And laughter, that forbidden thing, felt like rebellion, but shame still lingered, heavy, waiting. Then, one afternoon, back in the barracks, she unfolded her old letter, the one she never sent, the one that began, "They treat us well." The words stared up at her like an accusation, or maybe an invitation. She reached for another sheet of paper. This time, not to write to her mother. She wrote to herself. "Naoko," she began, just her name, no ranks, no honorifics. You are still here, you are still breathing, you have not forgotten, you are not unfaithful for surviving, you are not weak for wanting to grow." Her handwriting was uneven, but the sentences poured out. She wrote about the flowers, about the music, about the peach, the harmonica, the cowboy's broken Japanese and his gentle shrugs. She did not excuse the war, she did not forgive what had been done, but she allowed herself to feel something her commanders had forbidden: complexity. When she folded the letter, she tucked it not beneath her pillow, but into her waistband, close to her body. It wasn't much, but it was hers. Are you finding this story as moving as we are? If so, give this video a like and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The first day he didn't appear, she told herself not to notice. It was hot, the kind of heat that makes everything feel heavier, and the shadows under the barracks stretched long and still. She weeded the garden with slow, deliberate movements, never once glancing toward the post by the fence. Not once. Not even when the wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and something faintly metallic. Not even when the harmonica didn't play. The second day, she lingered by the garden a little longer, just in case. By the third, she asked, casually, or so she hoped, if the cowboy was on another shift. The guard shrugged. "Transferred," he said, almost bored. "Happens all the time." Just like that. Transferred. No goodbye. No harmonica tune. No peach in a napkin. Naoko didn't cry. She watered the flowers. She trimmed the dead leaves from the tomato vines. She peeled potatoes when asked. She folded sheets and sorted rice. And when the music played again through the camp's speakers, she sat still and listened without humming. But something in her moved, quietly. She did not realize until later that she had been waiting. Not for him exactly, but for what his presence had given her. The mirror. The unexpected reflection of herself in someone she had been told was beneath dignity. And now that mirror was gone, and yet she did not break. Absence is a strange kind of presence. It magnifies what's been left behind. In the cowboy's silence, she heard the echo of every word he hadn't spoken, every offhand comment that had carried more weight than he knew. "Try these. They like the sun." "You can tell your mama we ain't monsters." "Naoko." He had said her name like it mattered. And now that he was gone, she realized she still carried it, not as a prisoner's ID, but as a person, a woman. Each morning she returned to the garden, not because she expected him to appear, but because it was hers now, her space, her ritual. her choice. The other prisoners noticed. One offered to help with watering. Another left a folded crane made of newspaper beside the flower bed. They didn't speak of the cowboy, but they didn't have to. His absence had marked more than just Naoko. Then, one morning, as she knelt in the garden with her sleeves rolled to the elbows, she saw it. The first bloom. It wasn't grand, not the kind of flower you'd see in a parade or painted on silk, but it was real. A stubborn, defiant splash of orange against green. She reached out to touch it, but stopped herself. Instead, she sat back on her heels and simply looked. The flower had no idea who planted it. It didn't bloom for the cowboy, or for Japan, or for war. It bloomed because the conditions were right, because it had been given water, time, light. And so had she. Something inside Naoko settled that day. Not an ending, but a knowing. She was no longer surviving by obedience. She was living by choice. He was gone. The war was not. The fences remained, but so did she, rooted, blooming, and no one could take that from her. The train back to Tokyo was slow, crowded, and nearly silent. Naoko sat wedged between two older women who smelled of seaweed and salt, their belongings wrapped tightly in cloth bundles at their feet. The windows rattled in their frames. The countryside passed in long, aching stretches of gray and green. She kept the small satchel on her lap, clutching it gently, like something breakable. Inside were three things: a coarse American blanket, a folded drawing of the flower she had grown, rendered in careful pencil strokes by another prisoner with a gift for sketching, and one unopened tin of peaches. She never asked herself why she brought it. When she stepped onto the platform in Yokohama, the air smelled of ash and boiled rice. Her shoes crunched over shattered tiles and loose stone. The city, what was left of it, looked nothing like the place she had left behind. Roofs had vanished. Entire blocks were reduced to timber skeletons. Her breath caught in her throat. She walked for miles. When she found her mother, the woman was sitting beside a bucket of laundry, her frame thinned to the bone, her eyes sharp but glassy. They stared at each other for a long time. No embrace, just the recognition of what still existed. Naoko bowed deeply. Then she handed her mother the blanket. They did not speak of the war, not that first day, not for many days after. There were too many other things to speak of: rice to be boiled, wounds to be cleaned, roofs to patch, neighbors to bury. But at night, when the wind slipped through the broken boards of their rebuilt walls, Naoko would reach into her satchel and trace her fingers over the tin. The label was faded now, the metal warm from her touch. She never opened it. She didn't need to, because she remembered exactly what it had tasted like: the softness, the syrup, the absurd sweetness that had made her pause mid-chew and question whether she was dreaming. That peach was not a meal. It was a moment, and so was the drawing of the flower, now pinned beside her futon, a silent rebellion against the gray outside and the gray she had once carried inside. Naoko was no longer a prisoner, but she was not the woman who had bowed before commanders, who had questioned nothing, who had prepared herself to die without ever having lived. She was different now, not dishonored, not shamed, changed. There were times she missed the harmonica, the way its notes had drifted through the camp like a lullaby for lost souls. She missed the silence between words, the space the cowboy had left for her to exist without demand. He had never asked her to become anything, only allowed her to be. And in that small, radical space, she had grown. Sometimes Naoko would walk to the edge of a nearby field. There, among the weeds and rusted wire, she would crouch and press her fingers into the soil. not to plant, just to feel. The dirt was different, but the act was the same. She had returned to a country in ruins, but she brought something intact: memory, dignity. A single tin of peaches and a story she would never fully tell, not to her mother, not to neighbors, not even to herself in full. Because some truths don't need retelling. They simply stay. If this story moved you, please like the video and let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what part of this journey stayed with you most?